It's amazing how many of these companies were nothing more than pastors that were leading their men into battle. It was pastors that were stirring up and doing so much, and this is what he said, Bishop Galloway said, mighty men they were, men of iron nerve and strong hand, and unblenched cheek and the heart of flame. He says, when you look at these pastors, they were just generally very, very tough guys. A great example was John Wise. I mentioned John Wise is the one who had the book of sermons that the founders reprinted in 72 and 74. He had so many very specific things that said, and that they used actually in writing the Declaration. But John Wise, actually, he was a wrestler at his young age. And he pastored a church up in Ipswich, Massachusetts. It's a town on the bay. And there was a sea captain from across the bay who decided he wanted to challenge John Wise to a wrestling match. Because he was up and coming. John Wise used to be the man of the town. So he challenges John Wise to a wrestling match. John Wise humbly declines. Says, you know what? My hair is gray. I'm old. I don't wrestle anymore. This young captain persists to the point that he gets on his horse and follows John Wise to his house. Says, I'm not leaving until we wrestle. I mean, this young man really wanted to prove something. Says, I'm not leaving until you wrestle me. Actually followed John Wise through his front gate, through the front little picket fence, inside his yard. John Wise turns around and says, I'm not doing this. He says, I'm not leaving until you do it. John Wise says, fine, I'll wrestle you. The young captain says, good. John Wise walks over, picks up the young captain, carries him to the edge of the fence, and throws him out into the road. The young captain gets up on the road, dusts himself off, and says, thank you, sir. I'll be on my way now. Would you mind throwing me my horse, too? John Wise was a tough guy, but not only was he tough physically, John Wise was also known as being very tough spiritually. In fact, I mentioned that he pastored a church there in the Bay, and because he was on the Bay, a lot of the men from his church were fishermen. And as fishermen, they did a lot of work out in boats out in the Bay. And they actually one day had a group of pirates come in. And pirates actually captured their ship. They took them in and they went out to sea. Well, they have a prayer meeting that night at church to pray for the guys who were just taken by pirates. And so they come together and pray. And John Wise leads the prayer. And as he prays for two things. He says, Lord, we ask either that you help them, number one, to escape, or number two, that you would help our men to rise up and butcher their assailants. Well, 2 days later, the men come walking back into town with a tale of how they were able to slay every one of their captors. So all the people of the town go, you know what, not only is he tough physically, he prayed that God would help them butcher their assailants, and they killed every one of them. Our pastor can pray. People understood that these were tough guys. Another great example is the Reverend James Caldwell. The Reverend James Caldwell actually pastored a church and led his congregation into battle at the same time. So he's still pastoring his church. Well, during one of the skirmishes, his men are running out of wadding, which for a muzzle-loaded weapon, if you run out of wadding, you cannot fire the weapon any longer. You have to have the wadding. Well, they are now out of wadding. And so now, first of all, we're very undersupplied when it came to munitions. We didn't really have that many guns to oppose the British with. Well, now the guns we have, we can't even shoot anymore. Well, they got backed up to the edge of the town. Well, the Reverend James Caldwell, being the intelligent man that he is, also a pastor, said, men, follow me. And they ran to a church. He ran inside to the church, and he grabbed a stack of hymnals from the church. And he came out with what were known as Isaac Watts hymnals. They were he was the major hymnal guy of the day. So he came out, and he held up his stack of hymnals, and he said, let's give them Watts, boys. Was his famous line. Let's give them Watts. This pastor is using hymnals to fight the British. Amazing. But this is what Bishop Galloway said, mighty men they were. They were men of iron nerve, strong hand, unblenched cheek, and a heart of flame. Now, not only did this guy I mentioned, the Reverend James Caldwell, when he went and got the hymnals, the British, as I've already mentioned, were very opposed to pastors because they believed pastors were the ones that were stirring the people up to action. Well, the British found out actually where the Reverend James Caldwell lived. And they went and they surrounded his house, snuck up at his house, surrounded his house one night, and they decided they were going to kill him. So he and his wife are sitting down to eat dinner, and they opened fire at him into the house, into the room where they're eating dinner. Well, he's actually able to escape without being shot, but his wife was shot and killed that night. The next Sunday, he gets up in his church, And he gets up in his pulpit, and he brought just the most massive. He said he wanted to find the biggest Bible he could. So he brought the biggest Bible he could find, and he opened the Bible, put it up right on the pulpit, and then he drew a pistol. And he put a pistol down, and he drew a second pistol. And he put a second pistol down, and he looked at his congregation. He said, the British will not stop me from preaching, but they are welcome to try. I mean, this guy's awesome. But the fortitude of these pastors to go, you know what? I'm not backing down from the Word of God. I'm not backing down from preaching what God has compelled me to preach. It was the stamina, the fortitude of these guys that led to what we have. And that's why for so long we can point to pastors and recognize pastors. Another great example is John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg. He actually pastored 2 churches in Virginia. In Woodstock, Virginia, he pastored a German-speaking Lutheran church and an English-speaking Episcopal church. And he also was part of the Virginia legislature, and so they were meeting in Williamsburg, Virginia. So he's meeting, and this is before the revolution has really started. It's in January 1776, before we've declared our independence. Well, as they're meeting in January, a group of British soldiers come marching into town. And as they come into town, they actually begin to seize all kinds of different food goods. They take all the guns from the town, and they really just begin to loot the town. Well, Patrick Henry was there because he was part of the Virginia legislature. He was there at the time, and he said, I'm not putting up with this. He rallied about 5,000 farmers, and they went and surrounded the 200 British soldiers on the road out of town, and they said, you're giving us our stuff back. Without a shot fired, the British turned over everything they had taken from the town. But it was at this point that in Virginia, they realized, you know what, our own government, that's our own soldiers. We don't have our own military yet. We're still part of the English system, and our own soldiers have just come and opposed us. Our own soldiers have just come, and they've just robbed and looted from us. They realized, you know what, we got a problem. And this is when they acknowledged we're going to have to start fighting back. Well, the Reverend John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg, he mounts a horse. And he rides 197 miles back to Woodstock, Virginia, which is where he pastors churches. He gets back to Woodstock, Virginia, and he says, he gets there in time actually for Sunday morning service. He gets up on his pulpit, he opens his Bible, and he reads to his congregation from Ecclesiastes chapter 3, which says there's a time for everything, a season for every purpose under heaven. And he starts in verse 1, a time to be born and a time to die. And he goes all the way through to verse 8, which says, and there's a time for peace, and there's a time for war. He closed the Bible, and he told them what had just happened in Williamsburg. He told his congregation, the British have come, they've opposed us. He says, it's no longer a time for peace, but it's a time for war. He then closed in prayer. And instead of doing what he always did and going to the vestry room to disrobe, he actually stepped out in front of the pulpit and he removed his clerical robe to reveal that he was wearing the uniform of an army officer in the Continental Army. And his church had one narrow aisle. It was 2 very long rows down either side and one narrow aisle. And he began to walk down the narrow aisle. And he told them, God has given us our freedoms. But if we don't stand and fight to defend those freedoms that God has given us, we're going to lose our freedoms. He got to the back of the church, turned around and said, I'm going to fight to defend those freedoms. Who's going with me? Well, 300 men got up and met him at the back of the church. They became known as the 8th Virginia Brigade. Now, John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg, it was one of the very few major generals of the American Revolution. You see him right here. Very few guys achieved that rank, and you have a pastor that did that. Which, by the way, if you ever have a chance to go to Virginia, you can go to Valley Forge. In Valley Forge, which is where we had the very severe, harsh winter in 78 and 79, if you have a chance to go there, you're going to find barracks that are still up, and you'll find the Muhlenberg's barracks, which is where the men from his church actually built that barracks so they could try to survive the harsh winter at Valley Forge. Well, the Reverend John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg also had a brother. His brother was Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg, and he pastored a church up in New York. And as he pastored this church in New York, he heard what his brother had done. He wrote his brother a scathing letter. He said, John, what were you thinking leaving the pulpit, getting out to fight, encouraging your men to go fight? What is wrong with you? Now, I do need to point out, the British had not yet reached New York yet. So he's telling his brother, how dare you do? So he wrote his brother a letter. And in this letter, he wrote his brother talking about what he had done up in the pulpit and how dare you do that. He said, brother, you would have acted for the best if you had kept out of this business from the beginning. I now give you my thoughts in brief. I think you were wrong. Which is about as brief as you could be. He said,